my distinct pleasure to kick off our opening CFP and our opening talks today. I can't wait to introduce y'all to Christine and Bill. They are speaking on SweetQuadreams or Nightmare Before Christmas, Dissecting an iOS O-Day. Christine is a senior mobile security researcher at Microsoft who analyzes iOS O-Day for a living and runs the Her Hacks podcast. She is the best. And then Bill is a senior researcher at the CitizenLab whose work on Finfisher, NSO, and Sidetracks has basically been the impetus of a lot of actions against companies in this space. So please give them a big, warm welcome. Christine and Bill, please give them a welcome.
I have some concerns about this. Okay, good. We're very different heights, so we can't share a microphone. All right. So everybody see that? All right. Thank you, Winona, for that introduction. So again, my name is Christine. So before we jump into it, while everyone's getting settled down, just a note about our talk. So we're talking about an attack from 2021. So sorry we're not dropping any CVEs on stage because we do like to participate in responsible disclosure, meaning that Apple has fully patched this exploit and the vulnerabilities that we're talking about. So sorry if anyone's disappointed, but that's how we like to roll at Microsoft and CitizenLab. So a little bit about me. I am a researcher at Microsoft. I work on a lot of different things. In addition to reverse engineering the nation-state malware with Mystic, I also contribute to the Defender for Mobile product, which is just an app that you put on your Android or iOS device. Additionally, I've actually contributed to some features for Security Copilot. So there's a really awesome tool called File Analyzer that will automatically analyze malware using LLMs. And also check out my podcast, Her Hacks Podcast. It's every listen to content. It's a podcast by women in cybersecurity for everyone.
Hi everyone. Let's see if we can turn this on. Okay, let's switch on there. Hi everyone. I'm trying my best to juggle these two mics here. So I am Bill Marczak. I work at the CitizenLab, based at the University of Toronto. Though fortunately, I'm based here in the United States, so I don't have to deal with the brutal Canadian winters. And I'm not talking about the 51st state of Canada, I'm actually based in California. Anyway, so the CitizenLab does a variety of work in different fields, mainly the intersection of internet freedom and human rights. So where I work is in the sub-area of targeted threats, specifically on the topic of mercenary spyware, which we'll get to in a little bit. You might be familiar with some of the CitizenLab's research digging into companies, spyware companies such as NSO Group and their Pegasus spyware, QuaDream, which we're talking about today, Sidetracks and Predator, their Predator spyware, as well as Kangaroo and their spyware. It's a big industry. You might have also seen some of our recent work with Meta digging into Paragon, a new company in this space, and our work looking at some USB restricted mode issues recently. But let's talk about iPhones. So if you're a threat actor and your desire is to hack or spy on someone's iPhone, obviously there has to be some initial access vector to get on their phone. So way back in the day, when we first started digging into mobile spyware, around about 2016, we saw mostly cases of individuals receiving text messages, like this case here of a text message sent to an activist in the UAE, Ahmed Mansour, which promises in Arabic new secrets about torture in prisons in the UAE. So he's a human rights activist, unfortunately in prison at the moment for social media posts. But he received this, and to a normal human rights activist, perhaps this would seem interesting information, although perhaps a little strange to get it from an unsolicited info SMS number, as you can see there. But this was sort of what we were seeing mostly back in the day in 2016 or so, right? This idea that you socially engineer a target into clicking on a dodgy link to a website you control, and then you deploy whatever CVE, WebKit CVE of the week against them to compromise their device, coupled with privilege escalation, and ultimately running a spyware process on the victim's device. So this was sort of how things were way back in the day. Of course, more recently, we've been seeing so-called zero-click techniques more and more often. So the first major one of these that we were involved with at CitizenLab was back in 2021 with the so-called forced entry exploit that NSO Group was using to deploy Pegasus onto targets' phones. So this was actually pretty clever. Google Project Zero has a nice write-up of the technique. Essentially, the hackers were able to build a virtual CPU in the JDIG2 decoder for PDFs. Pretty clever technique, and they also found a code path, which an unsandboxed PDF decoded code path in iMessage. More recently, we've seen the trend continue. Of course, in 2023, there was the famous WebP exploit, again used to deploy Pegasus via iMessage onto targets' phones. And of course, who could forget the Kaspersky Lab Operation Triangulation Report, another famous zero-click case directed at iPhones. But before we go any further, we've been throwing around these terms, zero-click, zero-day. I want to let my colleague, Christine, here define them.
All right, so just to level set with everybody, I'm going to talk about the difference between a zero-click and zero-day. You can imagine a zero-click exploit is a subset of zero-day, but not all zero-days are zero-click. So a zero-day is an exploited vulnerability for which there's no patch available when we see it exploited in the wild. So a great example of this was the first exploit that Bill talked about, somebody getting a text message in any CVE that's usually referencing some type of zero-day attack. However, a zero-click is a remote vulnerability, which requires no user interaction, no clicking. So the latter three exploits that he discussed were automatically exploiting the device without the user even knowing that it happened. And this is because zero-clicks are focusing on some type of payload parsing. So the end device is going to process that payload and the exploit will be delivered without any user interaction. And so the exploit that we're talking about today that we're going to get to is actually both a zero-day and zero-click exploit. So iMessage in particular has been a popular target of zero-day, zero-clicks, and that's because it has a feature-rich attack surface. So there's so many things that you can send via iMessage. You can send PDFs, you can send content cards, you can send GIFs, you can send videos, and so this has become a very popular attack surface, particularly by NSO Group and some of these other nation states. So Apple kind of got wise to this and said, we are going to lock down iMessage. We are tired of people targeting it. And so they actually built a sandbox called Blastdoor.
So this takes us up to iOS 14, way back in the day of, I guess, 2021, when iOS 14 was mainstream. Apple had introduced this feature called Blastdoor. Now, Blastdoor, for those of you who are familiar, is a sandbox written in Swift, Apple's, I guess, memory-safe language, which tries to isolate or minimize the interface between any sort of complex decoding processes involved in processing iMessage and the rest of the system. So, in particular, one very juicy component of iMessage that was attacked over and over was IM transcoder agent, which, as you might imagine, is responsible for transcoding various attachments, formats into other formats, images, like with Apple's Image.io library. It's sort of a kitchen sink of at least a dozen different formats, including some legacy or older code. So it's definitely something that threat actors take a very close look at. And Apple, obviously realizing this, instituted a sandbox to try and mitigate some of this. So anytime, right, you have a sandbox, there's the old adage, show me a 10-foot sandbox, I'll show you an 11-foot sandbox, escape. So there's sort of multiple ways you can look at this, right? So we saw, in response to Blastdoor, threat actors like NSO trying to attack or circumvent Blastdoor. So either Blastdoor sandbox escapes, like we saw in 2023, or simply finding a code path that is not Blastdoor, like forced entry. But The threat actor we're going to be talking about today did something a little bit more clever, right? They said, well, to heck with iMessage. We're not going to focus on that. We're going to find some other juicy zero-click attack surface on the device.
So we're going to get into the story of not only how we discovered this exploit, analyzed it, reverse engineered it, but also how we were able to shut down a threat actor for good. So starting with the discovery of the attack. Anytime you're doing any type of mobile reverse engineering, you kind of have two options that you can start with. So the first option would be a top-down analysis, and this is when you have the sample. So reverse engineers like me usually start with a sample, and we're going to reverse engineer it using like IDA or Ghidra to do some kind of static analysis. Then you're going to want to detonate the sample and see really what it does. So you can use something like Frida. But what I'll do is I'll detonate the sample and then see like, is there anything that was left behind? Did it try to write to certain files? And what artifacts are left over on the device? Conversely, if you don't have a sample, maybe you're like CitizenLab and you're starting with a potentially infected victim device, you're going to do a forensic analysis on the phone, which means that you will get some type of forensic dump and analyze that dump to see, is there anything weird going on that's kind of outside of the norm? Is there what's called an implausible artifact? And by looking through these logs, this is how CitizenLab actually is able to detect unknown spyware.
Great. So Christine mentioned, I guess our video cut out there a little bit.
Oh no.
Maybe jiggle the connector and see if we can, or is this a generator fail?
On it, one second.
Okay. Well, so to further Christine's point about implausible artifacts, and while we're waiting for the screen to come back on, an implausible artifact we define as something which would not exist on the phone, would it be a certain evidence that something is run from a certain directory, evidence indicating that a process is consuming data when it's not supposed to be. Something like that would really only be explained by the presence of some sort of, or the idea that the phone was exploited and infected with some sort of spyware. So the examples on the slides, which you can't see, are, what an example would be evidence that a binary on an iPhone was run from this directory, which back in the day was very popular with threat actors, private var, DB, calm, Apple, XPC, roll account staging, normally used for iOS updates and things like developer mode, but had some permissions reasons and other reasons why threat actors would want to choose that directory to execute out of. Ooh, I saw some flashes. Anyway, also evidence that a process ran from /tmp. Nothing should be run from /tmp, but again, pretty popular with threat actors because on the iPhone, /tmp is not persisted across reboots. And it's a nice place where if you're trying to use or deploy your spyware in a way that you don't want it to be captured, you might gravitate towards directories like /tmp. Or in the case of Kaspersky's Operation Triangulation report, one of the implausible artifacts they noted in their analysis was the name of a process called backup agent, which was logged as consuming mobile data. Ooh, here we go. Okay, let me pop into the iOS display settings here and recalibrate this. Troubleshooting the production area.
The top right thing that says mirror.
Oh.
Oh.
Oh, enough again. No.
I broke it when I clicked advanced. That's what that explains.
Well, okay. we know science, right? Examples of implausible artifacts, right? The rule of campus staging directory, miners running from /tmp, processes like a backup agent that are not supposed to consume mobile data, seem consuming mobile data. And one sort of side note to this idea, right, is this notion of implausible artifacts in the way that I've sketched it assumes a particular attack model, which is that the attacker's ultimate goal is to launch their own spyware process, which conducts privileged actions in a way that might be logged on the device. However, there are other models, like what we've seen with reports about Paragon and their spyware, targeting the report, the way Paragon portrays their spyware in the media is that it sort of only exists within the confines of a certain channel that is being targeted, rather than necessarily escalating and getting everything from the
Somehow getting worse.
Yeah.
Wait, power fluctuation.
Is mine right?
When people use the elevator, it draws too much power. Is it back?
Test.
Yeah, okay.
Okay. Audio is back. Let's pause it before.
It should be coming on in a second.
Yeah, so how do we use implausible artifacts? So one of the things that we do at the CitizenLab is we work and liaise with civil society, meaning dissidents, journalists, opposition politicians, these sorts of types of people. And we might offer journalists, for instance, an opportunity to get their phone checked. And we might look at some output, forensic output of their phone, and look to see if there's any of these implausible artifacts. So we were doing checking back in 2021, and we saw a number of devices that had a particular suspicious, implausible path on them. And I hope that we get the projector back so show it to you. But if I can show it to you. It is a path within this private variant XPC roller campy staging directory, a process by the name of subbridged, which is a legitimate process on iOS, but it should never be run from that directory. The legitimate version should never be run from that directory. Furthermore, the phone is negative for Pegasus and other types of spyware that we look for. So it was kind of pretty clear to us at this point that we were looking at a new threat actor.
So CitizenLab had found this malicious IOC on a potentially infected device, but they didn't really know where it came from. Meanwhile, at Microsoft Threat Intelligence is constantly tracking in the wild threats with the Microsoft taxonomy, which you do not see here, but that's the storm, sleet, tsunami, snow, rain, all that. So that's how we track threat actors in the wild. And so what ended up happening was Microsoft had received a sample from a partner that actually had that same private var db role account d staging subbridge d string. So we had an exact match to the string that CitizenLab had. In our sample, it was like a heavily obfuscated string that upon initial static analysis, we had to deobfuscate. So it was really, really cool because we were like, hey, we have an IOC that's actually tied to a known threat actor, and CitizenLab had a victim device that had been targeted by that same string, or that showed that same IOC. Of the mill spyware. Anytime you see malware, it'll do some kind of OS fingerprinting, but particularly on like iOS implants, you'll see it's asking for the iOS version, asking for carrier info, and it's trying to gather device status. So it'll try to figure out what Wi-Fi you're on, if you're connected to Wi-Fi, if the phone is connected to airplane mode. And then it did, things that are probably spying, like recording audio, taking pictures, tracking location of the user. This particular sample also did some things that were unique to this particular threat actor. So they were exfiltrating and deleting keychain items on the device, exfiltrating and deleting other files on disk, and we didn't see any persistence mechanism, but that's also very normal because of iOS system protections. So it is almost impossible to get true persistence in the true definition of it on iOS today, and that's partially because of the way that the boot chain is created. So the iOS boot chain is a series of steps where each preceding binary is going to verify cryptographically the next stage of the bootloader. So what you'll see is the boot ROM will load the LLB, and then iBoot, and then that will load the kernel, and that will load the iOS operating system, but it's all leveraging the secure enclave, which is a coprocessor on the iOS chipset that is using a hardware key to cryptographically verify each element. So that's what makes the iOS boot chain so secure. So there are some examples of persistence that Bill's going to talk about that are kind of persistence, but they're not true persistence.
Lowercase p persistence, if you like. Right, so you can divide these into kind of two columns, the ones that are sort of more theoretical and the ones that have been observed in the wild. So in the theoretical column, we have techniques like the one that ZegOps posted on a while back, where, okay, well, you don't actually shut down the phone, you fool the user into thinking that the phone is being shut down, right? Because malware's on the device, it can control anything, it can, when you push the shutdown button, it can hook that and throw up a fake shutdown screen, turn off the screen, make you think it's off, but it's not actually off. So the way the spyware survives restart is the phone's never actually restarted. So what we've seen in the wild has been actually pretty interesting. Way back in 2016, the first Pegasus sample we analyzed, there was a pretty clever persistence technique, right? So remember, secure boot chain, everything, certificate verified, yada, yada, yada. Well, okay, what if you replace one Apple sign binary with another Apple sign binary? They're both valid, the signature is totally fine. So it should pass signature verification and all that. So what the threat actors did, Pegasus in that case, was they found this binary RT-buddy-D, which I guess didn't do anything too important because they collaborated it and replaced it with the JavaScript core binary, which, as its first argument, can take the path to a file on disk containing JavaScript, which will then be executed by JavaScript core. So they found that RT-buddy-D was invoked with a early boot argument. So they just dropped a file on disk called early boot and put the JavaScript exploit in there. And then magically on reboot, there was reinfection. So that was pretty clever. Since then, we've seen a little bit more off-the-wall techniques. Like in Predator, the Cytox's Predator spyware in 2021, we saw them using an iOS shortcut automation. So if you have an iPhone and you're like a really hardcore power user, like maybe you've got some complicated home setup where you want when I get home I want the lights to turn on in the entryway or something like this. I don't know, like all these automations that you can think of. So you can also do these for your phone. Like you can say, well, when I open a certain app, lock the phone screen or something, right? Like a sort of a way to maybe get some additional security. But it turns out that you can also use these for persistence, right? You can, in this case, we saw the threat actor have a precondition, which was when any one of 40 some apps is opened, which would happen when the phone is rebooted, then a chain of actions is executed, which results in the phone fetching, not visible to the user, but fetching a web page and rendering it in the background with WebKit. So you just code a URL to your exploit for persistence, and just a normal WebKit exploit, and it loads and reinfects the phone, and small p persists the infection whenever the phone reboots. But I think the larger point here, right, is we don't see a ton of these cases of persistence just because you don't really need it. You can get persistence through reinfection if you have a zero-click, right? Remember our definition of zero-click: no special access, no proximity, no user action required to get infected. It's just the phone's in your pocket, it can get infected because it's automatically deserializing and processing something. So you don't need persistence in that case. You just persist by refiring the exploit again. And you could also potentially think about disabling certain updates or breaking certain security features on the phone to make it easy to reinfect and ensure that if your exploit is ever patched, you don't lose that persistent access to a device that's already been infected. Okay, so that was pretty interesting. One of the other interesting things we learned from this sample was a clever technique they were using to subvert iCloud two-factor authentication. So I'm sure everyone in this room has used 2FA, you know what it is. This is a 6-digit code or what have you that you type in when you have to sign into your Apple account. It's mandatory on Apple. Other services have it as optional. The way that it works at a very, very 100,000 foot level on iOS is that there's a process on the phone, which is some black box, add ID, also called NSO. Its control flow is obfuscated with Apple's Fair Play DRM. It's quote-unquote hard, although not impossible, to reverse engineer. But why would you bother reverse engineering it when you can just treat it like a black box? So what they do is they actually inject some code into this add ID process, which allows them to, in some way, control the generation of these codes. So I'll explain how that works in a second, but I'm going to throw it over to Christine to explain a little bit about how this code injection works on iOS.
So a common technique that a lot of threat actors use is called dial-up injection, and this is how they can circumvent the inability to patch binaries and run a binary on disk. So what they do is they actually write to a dial-up, and then they have that dial-up loaded into memory, and then is executed by the target process. So by doing this, you're able to inherit all of the permissions, all of the entitlements that that target process has. So there's some really awesome code that Jonathan Levin, who you might be familiar with, he wrote like all the iOS, macOS folks. He actually has some POC code on his website that I'm going to walk you through. So the first thing, and remember, it's really, really hard to get to this point on iOS because you need to have root access to be able to do this. So imagine that we're the threat actor, we have bypassed all of those mitigations. This is how they take that next step and control iCloud 2FA. So the first thing is they need to find the PID of the target process, which in this case is add ID. And so you need to grab the task port for that using this very useful function, task for PID. The next thing is you need to allocate memory within the process that you have the task port of, because you are about to write shellcode into that memory. So you allocate some memory, and then you're going to write some shellcode into that memory, then make it executable so that the shellcode will run. But you might be wondering, well, like what is supposed to be in my shellcode that is just like running in memory? And so the shellcode is actually going to leverage what's called the DYLD shared cache, which is like a shared library that's actually shared by all iOS system processes for various different functions, such as DLOpen. So you are going to have some shellcode that has a pointer to DLOpen, and you're going to DLOpen a dilib on disk that has all of the malicious functionality that you're interested in executing. So this could be overwriting functions that you need, but it's all things that require the entitlements that add-ID already has. So the last thing that you do in order to kick off this shellcode executing is you have to spin off a thread. So by executing a thread out of add-ID, you are not spinning off a new process, so AMP will not bother you, but you are executing still within the context of add-ID, which grants you all of those entitlements that you need to do the things with iCloud 2FA that you need to do.
So what do you actually do with this injected code? Well, we recovered and analyzed the code that was injected into the add-ID process. And essentially, what the code was doing relies on understanding the scheme that Apple uses for these two-factor codes. It's pretty standard, TOTP, time-based runtime password. In other words, the sole inputs to the function that is generating the two-factor codes are, number one, some private key material, and number two, the system time. What is the current block call time? So what this code does is pretty clever. It simply fools add-ID into thinking it's the wrong time. In other words, it hooks the get time of day function and allows the spyware's operator to send a message to add-ID to change the clock, from add-ID's perspective to some arbitrary time, and then request the generation of a two-factor code valid at that time. So you can see where this is going. They set the clock to the future and generate two-factor codes that are valid for arbitrary future times, exfiltrate those, and great. They have some sort of persistent way, semi-persistent way to get around iCloud 2FA without having to persistently change anything on the device. One of the other interesting features, besides the kind of unique functionality of what it could do that we haven't really seen before, is the ability for the spyware's operator to configure pretty complex rules that could govern the spyware's functionality based on inputs from sensors on the phone. So for example, they could condition certain actions, like only exfiltrate when the VPN is disconnected or when there's no proxy set. And cause the spyware to delete itself if a third-party jailbreak is detected, defined by some hard-coded paths. Is there a device attached via USB? Maybe that indicates the user is trying to debug their device or is trying to capture a copy of the spyware. In that case, you could hide the spyware, uninstall it, any number of actions. You might want to do certain things when the screen is locked or the screen is powered off, right? You probably all know that the phones these days have the little lights that come on. Oh, something's using the camera, something's using the microphone. So if the screen is turned off, maybe that might not show. So you might want to do certain things when the screen is off. You also can condition things based on temperature of the battery, which we found really interesting. But it actually makes sense because a common complaint that people come to us at CitizenLab with is, oh, Bill, I'm sure my phone is infected. It's running hot. That's a sure sign that my battery is draining. So this is a way that the operator could get around that, right? They could say, oh, well, if the battery is draining too much, stop draining the battery. If the battery's getting too hot, we'll stop capturing data for a while and wait till later. Also, of course, any sort of connectivity change, going to a new country, going within certain coordinates, you might want to trigger different behavior. And the operator can also and or not or pipe these together. One of the really curious things which led us to the theory of the exploit is we found that the spyware could receive a cleanup command from the command and control server that was managing the spyware infection. And upon receipt of this cleanup command, the spyware took 3 steps. The first step is it would open a file called calendar.sqlitedb on disk. Now, those of you who have an iPhone know that there's a very tightly integrated calendar app on the phone. And you know that you can have shared calendars with your friends. You can invite your friends to various events. When you invite your friend to an event, the friend will receive a pop-up notification from the calendar app. Christine has invited you to DistrictCon or something like this. Do you want to accept? So this is what the calendar.sqlitedb file is driving. It's driving sort of the calendar app's local view of the state of a shared calendar in iCloud. So the cleanup command opens this file. It runs several queries. The queries are all delete queries. And they contain a parameter, an email address supplied by the command and control server. So essentially what this is doing is deleting various traces from various cables for anything pertaining to an event about where the inviter is a certain email address. And then after this is done, because SQLite databases sometimes might persist deleted data, they do a vacuum of the database to make sure that deleted data is not being left around. So this is pretty interesting. We're thinking, okay, well, spyware typically exfiltrates data. It doesn't often delete data, unless there's something it's trying to cover up. So we thought, maybe this is a clue about the vector.
So what ended up happening was we realized that there might be something in the initial forensic analysis of the device that was missed. So CitizenLab went back to the device to see, are there any calendar invites on here that we don't see? But of course, they were deleted. However, even though the threat actor did this CNC cleanup command on the device, it did not go to where the backup of the calendar invite is, which is actually on the CalDAV server. So we're able to recover the original calendar invite from the CalDAV server to figure out, was this potentially the initial exploit vector used?
Yeah, so this is essentially what we recovered. And one sort of primer on the architecture of the protocol for synchronizing the calendar between the phone and the server. So it's at the top of the protocol layer is this thing called iCalendar. And iCalendar is there's an RFC for it. I think the development of the standard was mainly driven by folks at Apple, hence the name iCalendar. But iCalendar is essentially like a pretty easy to read plain text format where it's sort of key value delimited. There's certain keys that have certain values which tell you things about the event. So there's some defined keys like, I don't know, like DT end or something which tells you the time zone and date and time at the end of the event, and organizer, UID, DT stamp, location, things like this that encode various information about the event. And of course, the creator of the event can, as they see fit, define arbitrary keys and values. Now, the interesting thing about this iCalendar protocol, it's completely plain text, no structure, nothing in there beyond the key value pairs. This is transmitted between the server and the phone over the XML-based CalDAV protocol, which is in turn based on top of WebDAV and XML and all pretty complex stack. So one of the things that we noticed about this event and why it stood out to us, like how do we know this is suspicious? The first thing is the event was added 6 months after the end date of the event, right? But this is a bit odd, unless you're like, Stephen Hawking inviting, time travelers to an event in the past. Like, this doesn't really seem plausible, inviting someone to an event in the past. The other thing which we realized, which Apple has since fixed, is that before Apple fixed this, if you sent an invite to someone for a past date, there'd be no notification generated on the device. So invites to future events, notification, blah, 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 has invited you to an event. Here's the name, here's the details, do you want to accept or not? But for past events, notification not generated. So that was interesting. Furthermore, we noticed something very odd down here, which is that, so iCalendar defines keys called description and attendee. But in this case, the description and attendee tags in the key have these weird, like, closing and opening CData tags, which are absolutely definitively not part of iCalendar at all. There is no XML in iCalendar. This was very, very strange. And as I sort of alluded to earlier, what's going on the wire here between the phone and the server is this iCalendar plain text blob is being thrown into the middle of a XML blob, which is the CalDAV WebDAV thing, and the calendar event is included within this this opening and closing CData tags. So essentially, what the attackers what it looks like they're doing is closing off the initial CData tag, potentially inserting XML, although we didn't see any XML in the calendar event we recovered, but I'll get to that in a little bit. And then reopening the CData and including the rest of the event. So kind of interesting, right? It's a way to get access to the code path on the phone that's parsing the CalDAV XML document in a way that you're not supposed to have access to. So wait a minute, does this really work? Well, yes, we tested it. So if you send an event of this format to the phone, the thing in between the closing and the opening CData tag hits the XML parser. It's libxml2 in SAX mode. There's not vulnerabilities every day in libxml2, but you could imagine potentially something going on there, or Apple's wrapper around libxml2. Though we don't know specifically what was exploited because the XML was not included in that event that we recovered. And we'll get to that in a little bit. And this is totally cool with the phone's iCalendar parser because the iCalendar parser disregards anything that's not in the CData tag. So it doesn't even close its eyes when the XML is being parsed by libxml2, and then opens its eyes again when the CData starts. So what we see is a perfectly valid iCalendar event on the phone. So there's no crash or no warning generated within iCalendar with a calendar app. And this is all well and good, right? But can we actually test against the server, right? So we're uncovering this attack. We're looking into this case after it was conducted and after perhaps there have been some fixes implemented. But fortunately, yes, Apple does release, or did release, the old version of their iCalendar server. They have a newer version, which I guess is not open source. But they open source the old version. It's on GitHub. You can download it and pop it open in the Ubuntu VM and test it. So we're able to verify a couple things. First, we verified that the server, in fact, does reject the closing and opening seed data tags, but only if they're in the value portion of the key value pair. If they're in the key portion, it will happily accept them and store the event on the server and return that to the client when it's requested. Additionally, and this is where we got thwarted by QuaDreams' cleverness here. It turns out it is possible to update an invitation, though it's not possible to completely remove it from someone's calendar, and it's not possible to delete a key value pair, but you can update the value of a key value pair. So what we think the attackers did in this case is they updated the value of the description, close square bracket, close angle bracket key to remove the XML exploit they were using and just included the letter X. And this is borne out by the fact that the event that we recovered had an update counter of 1, which is 1 more than 0, which is the initial value for the update counter. So the event had been updated once since the initial version. So we think that there was this update by the attackers that removed the juicy XML stuff that would have allowed us to exactly zero in on what the precise issue was that they were exploiting. Nevertheless, this was a interesting case in that it's one of the few known, perhaps the only known case of an attacker, a zero-click attacker on iPhone, totally eschewing iMessage and finding a different zero-click service.
And much like Drake's career, QuaDream is also debunked, so it's ironic that we chose Christine. So after our reporting on these exploits, both Microsoft and CitizenLab reports, QuaDream actually declared bankruptcy and shut down for good. So we had some really cool impact from doing this work. Alright, so just some quick takeaways. First thing is collaboration and information sharing is so important. We wouldn't have even thought to find that calendar invite and query that CalDAV server if we had not been collaborating. We wouldn't have been able to because we didn't know any victims, and CitizenLab would not have had the information about the calendar being vacuumed. So really awesome benefits of collaboration. Remember also that cloud services are a new vector, and as convenient as it is for me to be able to send you a calendar invite just by knowing your Apple ID, that convenience factor is what's introducing this cloud-based threat vector, because now these PSOAs are able to target based on Apple ID, because they can conveniently deliver an exploit to anybody's iMessage or iCalendar just by knowing their Apple ID. So when creating these new features, just remember that cloud vectors are not only convenient, but an actual attack surface that should be managed appropriately. We also want to build the ball broader, not just taller in one place. So Apple's done an amazing job with Glassdoor, and they're actually expanding it to other services, which is awesome. And so other platforms should take this into consideration as well, because you want to make sure that you have full coverage of all different services, not just one or two. And lastly, lockdown mode is a really amazing feature on iOS. However, it's optional. It's not on by default. So you will not be protected by all of the features of lockdown mode if it's not on.
Yeah, to echo what Christine said there about lockdown mode, we think that lockdown mode would have blocked this attack had lockdown mode been available at the time. It wasn't introduced until iOS 16, this attack was on iOS 14. But the one of the important general philosophies behind lockdown mode is the idea that there should be no complex interaction possible from an untrusted iCloud account to a device that is lockdown mode on. So a bunch of automatic parsing is just turned off if the user that you're receiving the complex data from is not in your contact list. So lockdown mode is a great feature for sort of individualized defense, but whether lockdown mode alone moves the needle on the broader systemic issue remains to be seen. However, Apple is fortunately, as some of you may have seen, sending out notifications to individuals that they identify who have been hacked or targeted with certain types of spyware. Meta recently sent out notifications as well for Paragon cases. So it's good to see that positive development. So we do want to make sure to commend industry and cloud platforms for going in that direction. We'd like to see, I think, more of that as well, both because it has the potential to have a systemic impact, as well it can help direct attention to and uncover cases of abuse. So, thank you.
Thank you so much, everyone.